Okay, hello, welcome to Module 2 of this training entitled Caring for Patients Who Experience Domestic Violence.
Morning, everyone. I am Casey Kleeman. I have been the DV advocate and liaison out at Frederick Hospital through the agency of Sojourner. And I was grateful to be placed in the clinic and able to help out in that advocacy role.
And I am Erin Stewart. You may have seen me in day 1 of this training or module 1 of this training. I work at Sojourner and I do research in this area of domestic violence and do a lot of training in this area as well. Okay, so this is module 2, the second module in a 2-module series. So if you have not already viewed module 1, I'll ask that you go back and do that. There's some foundational material there about domestic violence 101 and the impact of domestic violence on the patients that you work for. Assuming you have seen module 1, we'll jump into what we'll learn in module 2. So today we will learn how to ask patients in your clinic about domestic violence. We'll review some do's and don'ts, as well as sharing with you some specific screening questions that you can ask your patients. We'll learn what to do next, right? So when somebody says yes, how do I respond? What resources and referrals do I have to offer them? And then really covered throughout this module, there is opportunities to pause what you're viewing and practice, do some brainstorming about how the skills that we're teaching you apply to your particular clinical setting, and to do some skills practice. When you're done with both modules in this training series, you will understand the domestic violence dynamics better. You will have heard survivor stories and their experiences shared throughout the training. You will learn some best practices for screening domestic violence in healthcare settings. And then I think importantly, you'll learn what to do when somebody says yes to those screening questions. So this is your trigger warning. The topics that we're going to talk about today are not easy, right? They're oftentimes hard to hear, hard to think about. But we believe in talking frankly about the experience of domestic violence, really so that we can promote understanding, empathy, and ultimately action. At the same time, we recognize that a lot of people even come to this work because of their own traumatic experiences and wanting to give back to the community. You are your own best expert at understanding what you need to take care of yourself, so we encourage you to do that throughout this training. Take breaks when you need to, or consult with some of your colleagues. And then lastly, I want to say here is that everyone deserves the right to be safe. And so if you are sitting here taking this training as a healthcare provider, but you're recognizing some of these dynamics that we're talking about in the relationships that you're a part of, please know that the resources in this training are for you too, and that you deserve to take care of yourself. All right. So talking to patients in a medical setting about domestic violence, it's not easy, right? I think it's hard from both a professional perspective as well as from a survivor perspective. So rather than avoiding the fact that this is a difficult or hard conversation, we welcome you at this point in the training module to pause this video and brainstorm reasons why a conversation about domestic violence might be hard from a professional perspective, and also reasons why conversations about domestic violence might be hard from a patient or a survivor perspective. So take a second now to pause your video and brainstorm.
So we will be going through some of the do's and do nots when it comes to talking about domestic violence, specifically intimate partner violence in any setting, but especially in the healthcare setting. So one of the things is do not ask sensitive questions in the presence of anyone other than the patient. From, survivor experiences, there can be a lot of shame or hesitation to discuss something as sensitive as abuse and threats and violence when it comes to these tough conversations. We always want to make sure that we are giving our full attention to the conversation and understanding that things that might be joyous, such as pregnancies to some, can hold a lot of trauma for others. In our previous trainings, we've heard survivors share their experiences of being asked about pregnancies in the presence of, say, their intimate partner. And there's experiences where somebody might get pregnant and determine what to do with that pregnancy on their own, not including their partner in that conversation just because of their own safety and their own preferences. Another thing is that a form of control for a lot of abusers is birth control, whether, using it to take it or not take it. So just being really sensitive about asking these questions just to the person that we're hoping to disclose with. One of the biggest do's that we've experienced throughout this study is that it is necessary to separate the patient from any other visitors when they come in. So they might come in with a friend, they might come in with their intimate partner, they might come in with children who might be older. And so it is really important to have these conversations one-on-one to be able to give them that space and that safety and security to be able to disclose. So these are just some quick examples of ways that you can communicate how the separation might be working so that people aren't confused, so that they understand what the process is. It could be something that the clinic policy is that it doesn't allow people within the first few minutes. It can be, here are some materials to kind of look through while we are talking to the patient just on their own. But always making sure that you're communicating with any guests that are arriving, that they won't miss anything that doesn't pertain to them within the appointment.
So Casey just told you how critical it is to make sure that you're asking sensitive questions to the patient and the patient alone, right? And that oftentimes involves separating that patient from others who might be attending their visit. Some of the language that we suggest here refers to like an obstetrical visit, right? A pregnant patient's visit, because we're talking about baby. But we include those examples because we know that that's one of the times that they are most likely to be accompanied by a partner, but we also recognize that's not the only time, right? There are other medical interactions in which they're coming with partners. So how you separate a patient from the others in their visit is really going to be dependent upon the particulars in your clinic, what type of care you're providing, the patient flow, and so on and so forth. And so this is going to be another opportunity for you to pause your video and do some brainstorming and some practice around this. What can be an awkward or difficult part of the procedure, which would be separating the patient in order to ask those questions. So at the conclusion of me describing here what you're going to do, I'd like you to pause the video and do a few things. First, I'd like you to think about how patient flow looks like in your clinic, and so that you can apply whatever procedure you're coming up with the logistics in the clinic that you work in, the medical setting that you work in. Second, keeping that flow in mind, right? What the reality is in the setting that you're working in. Can you brainstorm what are the best opportunities to separate the patients, even briefly, from somebody who might be accompanying them in your particular setting? That might be at check-in, or that might be a different point in the patient care, depending on what type of clinical setting you're in. Third, you're not the only person who works in your clinic, right? There are other folks that are involved in patient care and clinic flow. So taking a moment here to brainstorm who else might need to be involved if you were to move forward with a policy to separate patients from others attending the visit with them. And then lastly, as you're pausing your video here, the last thing you should be working on at this point is to practice a few scripted phrases that might work well in your clinic setting. We encourage people to come up with and practice things that feel natural to themselves. Everybody's going to put their own spin on it, but saying these things out loud and feeling comfortable with them will go a long way once you have to put it into practice with real patients in the clinic setting. So go ahead and pause your video now and work through these steps that we have suggested here.
So getting to some other do's and do nots, one of the biggest is do not avoid the subject completely. We understand that this can be a tough conversation to have, but avoiding it completely is not going to get us any solutions. Here are some things that, we have heard from providers who are concerned about bringing up this concept. So what if the patient doesn't trust me after having this conversation? What if they get angry or defensive? What do I do when somebody does say they are experiencing abuse? And what if I have to make a report on this? And so we're really hoping to give you the tools today through this training, and so that you feel comfortable having these conversations and knowing what the next steps are. But please do not avoid the subject completely, as that does not help solve any of the solutions. One of the biggest do's is you need to be critical in asking every patient if they are experiencing abuse. Something that we know about DV and IPV is that it doesn't pick and choose who it affects. So making sure that we're really going across the board and screening every patient for it, not letting any of our own assumptions or own biases dictate who we ask and who we do not, because you really never know who might disclose to you at that time. Or, maybe in the future, after you do ask the screening question, there's potential for opening that conversation. This does lead us to the next do not. This is, screening questions in terms of you will be asking them specifically. There is a yes or a no answer. There's also, they can prefer not to answer, but do not just ask the question once, check the box and move on. One of the crucial things in disclosing with IPV is validating their experiences. And when somebody sees it as just a checkbox or something that is just a task to the provider, it's really hard for them to continue on with those conversations or to potentially disclose in the future. As you see here, it's not uncommon for patients to deny abuse on an initial screening or even a later one, but after rapport is built or relationships are built, they could potentially disclose later on. One of the best ways that you can open these conversations for somebody to feel comfortable enough to disclose is to be fully present. Kind of going back to that last slide, don't just be looking down at the screening questions and asking them and checking the boxes. You really want to be using your body language to show that you are open to having this conversation. You want to provide that comfort for them and those solutions, and you're giving them their full attention. So important to eye contact is very important. Using open body language, not crossing your arms, not turning away, really just having that conversation person to person and validating their humanity, even though it is kind of a screening protocol within the setting. One of the other do's that goes along with asking every patient is to ask frequently. You want to make sure that safety at home is a conversation that's happening often, because there are certain things that are not talked about in a lot of settings. Some of the comments that we've heard is because abuse is so common, using the opening to just tell every patient that abuse is so common that you ask all of your patients in the clinic about the safety in the relationship can let them know that this is a normalized conversation to have, and that if they are affected, they're not the only one, and you're not picking them out just to ask these questions. And so I would say continue asking, continue to normalize the conversation about safety. One of the other big important things is to have information about domestic violence in multiple places in your clinic. So obviously these conversations aren't just the start of what can be a disclosure, but people can see these other, informational images in bathrooms and think, oh, that might be me. How do I start this conversation? And so making sure that those are accessible to everyone that's walking into your clinic, maybe people who don't want to disclose to somebody face to face, but that they know that there's those resources out there. Some great places, like I mentioned, the bathroom is a very common place that you can put these. You can have service announcements playing across TVs, maybe in your waiting room. You could also have posters hung up. And most importantly, I would say always make sure you have resources that patients can take home with them. They might not be in the headspace at that time, at that appointment, to really process or consider what they're experiencing, but allowing them to have that education, it can be really empowering for those who do disclose later on. One of the last things with main do's is that you always want to look for nonverbal cues. When you're asking these questions, you might be getting a no to the screening question, but their body might be telling you something different. This is not so that you can push them to try and give you the answer that you're looking for or that you're thinking might be the case, but just really taking conscientiousness of the whole person and not just the words they use. We understand that trauma can do a lot of different things. And one of those things is that it is really hard to have these conversations. Paying attention to those and maybe making notes for that in the future conversations to screen again, ask it again, and open that conversation because you might have an idea of some of the nonverbal cues. You can always, be conscious of if somebody is agitated, if they feel, are looking embarrassed or shameful. These are some important things to think about for future disclosures.
Okay, in just a moment, we will share a specific screening tool that we suggest you could use in your clinic. Before I go ahead and share what those screening questions are, I also want to make clear that there are several screening tools that exist, right, and that have been studied in medical practice settings. So if the tool that we described doesn't feel like the right fit for your particular practice, or you have, say, another one maybe embedded in your electronic health records, that's okay. But I will make a suggestion here on what to look for in screening tools. And the two most important things are that the questions are behaviorally specific and that there are questions about multiple forms of abuse in the screening tool. So what do I mean by behaviorally specific? So sometimes you'll hear that clinics ask a more generic question about, do you have concerns about domestic violence? Or are you safe at home? Well, these questions certainly are better, I think, than not asking at all. They often lead folks to not disclose when they might actually disclose if you were to ask something more behaviorally specific. So many domestic violence victims don't self-identify as such, even though when you go on to ask about specific behaviors in the relationship, they are experiencing dynamics that domestic violence professionals would identify as dangerous in a relationship. So rather than asking a general question about, are you a victim of domestic violence? Do you have concerns about your safety at home? We really encourage that you find a screening tool that works for your clinic setting that has behaviorally specific questions. You'll see these as an example in the screening tool that I share in just a moment. The second most important factor to consider when you're looking at screening tools is, are we asking about multiple forms of abuse here? Sometimes we see screening tools that ask solely about physical abuse, and I think that also misses patients who might disclose and ignore other dangerous dynamics of domestic abuse. So things like coercive control, fear of a partner, or stalking are all really important dynamics to look for in a relationship that can be missed if you ask only about the physical aspects of the abuse. So if you have a different screening tool that you're considering, just sort of run it through these couple questions here. Are the items on this screening tool behaviorally specific? And do they ask about multiple forms of abuse? And if both of these things are true and the tool has been studied in a medical setting, I think you're in pretty good shape here. And so we'll share one example of a tool that you might want to use. This was a tool that we used within our pilot study in the OBGYN clinic. So this particular tool is called the HARK IPV screening tool, HARK. And it has 4 items that are simply yes or no questions. So the first item on the HARK is, within the last year, have you been afraid of your partner or ex-partner? Within the last year, have you been humiliated or emotionally abused in other ways by your partner or ex-partner? In the last year, have you been kicked, hit, slapped, or otherwise physically hurt by your partner or ex-partner? And then finally, within the last year, have you been raped or forced to have any kind of sexual activity by your partner or ex-partner? For the HARC tool in particular, a yes to any one of these questions or more than one of these questions would count as a positive disclosure here. And so as you're looking at these items on the HARC, you can see that they're behaviorally specific, right? It doesn't just ask in a general way if they're safe. It asks about specific actions, being kicked, being afraid. It also asks about multiple forms of abuse. We've got fear, we've got emotional abuse, physical abuse, and sexual abuse here in this particular screening question, or in this particular screening tool. So now is another chance for you to practice. Practice first, introducing the topic, right? So what are you going to say as sort of your preamble to introduce the topic of domestic violence to a patient? And then how are you going to ask those screening questions? So we'd like to encourage you to pause the video at this point and do two things. First, we'd like you to brainstorm what you will say to introduce that topic of domestic violence to patients before just jumping into the screening questions. What's the sentence or few sentences that you're going to say as your preamble? And then secondly, practice the introduction and the screening questions out loud. I think that this piece is particularly important because these questions are hard to ask, right? To ask about rape or to ask about physical abuse is heavy and a difficult thing to say, and you don't want the first time that these words come out of your mouth to be in the room with a patient. So we encourage you to pause the video now, brainstorm what you might want to say as an introduction to the topic, and then practice saying that as well as the screening questions in particular out loud. Okay. Now that we have practiced setting the tone, developing some rapport with the participant or the patient rather, and introducing the topic and asking the screening questions, you've done such a good job at those things. Somebody says yes. So the question now is, what do I do? What do I do when somebody has said yes, that they are experiencing domestic violence or intimate partner violence? And Casey's going to continue here with some do's and don'ts.
Like Erin mentioned, the yes to any of those questions is just one of the first steps to providing them, the support that they need. One of the main do's is that you need to believe the patient and what they're telling you. Validate their experiences and offer empathy. You're not going to be able to solve the entire relationship right in that disclosure, but what we have heard from survivors is that the validation and that believing of their experiences has been the most impactful piece of the response from whoever was doing the screenings. Some of the things that you can say in this moment would be, you don't deserve to be treated that way. Thank you for sharing that with me. That took tremendous courage to tell me. That sounds so hard. I'm sorry you're going through that. Something we know and understand is that everyone deserves to have a safe and healthy relationship. And so opening the conversation by validating them and believing them is your number one role in this screening. A big do not that can be very difficult to get past is not letting your own biases, experiences, opinions, or cultural lens negatively impact patient care. Patients are very in tune with conversations, surrounding their trauma and what feels good and what doesn't. And so understanding that the culture that we've been brought up in is typically a victim blaming culture. When it comes to conversations about DV and IPV, it's very common for people to say, well, why didn't you leave? Understanding what our own beliefs are when it comes to this kind of abuse and understanding that we are not going to be able to solve the problem right here, but that we need to really focus on fixing our own beliefs before we enter these conversations. One of the most important things is obviously throughout these slides, we have used a lot of pronouns in terms of she being the victim or survivors. And a lot of times we think about he pronouns when we talk about abusers or the other people in the relationships. Understanding that anyone can be in a relationship with anyone, and just using our conscientiousness of opening those conversations without making any assumptions, without jumping to conclusions, is definitely going to be important for building that rapport and, you know, gaining their trust. So that kind of goes along into this next do. Do be non-judgmental. Treat all of your patients as equal. Many actions that at first glance may seem problematic to you may be a safety strategy to this person. So sometimes we do see that people stay in relationships with the abusive partner, whether that is for a bunch of different reasons. That might be their best strategy to keep themselves safe, whether kids are involved, whether it's a housing insecurity issue. One of the other things we see is that clients may go through with getting a restraining order, and they still might have contact with that abusive partner. You might be confused. The restraining order is for your own protection. Why are you not, you know, utilizing it to its full extent? Well, again, other reasoning might allow survivors to feel comfortable enough, even with that in place, to have conversations with the other person. We understand that parenting can be a whole topic on its own, but never judge clients for how they discipline their children. We can only offer education and empowerment through that, and make sure you're treating everyone as an equal patient during screening. Some of the biggest things that people think about when it comes to these conversations, and you do get a positive disclosure, is that, okay, this person's trusted me with this information on a sensitive topic. How do I solve the whole problem? How do I get them out safely? We really want you to not get stuck on trying to fix or rescue the person. Again, it's a great first step that they've disclosed to you, but they are the expert on their own situation. And so giving advice or taking over can really take their empowerment from them, which is a whole thing in its own when it comes to people who have been abused, is not feeling in control of themselves. You're not here to diagnose anyone or prescribe solutions in that moment. You're there to provide support and validate their experiences. What we do know is that we should ask every patient that does disclose what they want. We need to be intentional about listening to what they're saying, and thinking about how we can support them safely in getting to those end goals. So some common questions that you can answer to kind of start those conversations is, do you feel safe leaving with the guests that you arrived with today? What do you want to happen today? What do you want to happen during your pregnancy? Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about that I didn't mention? As we saw, there's 4 screening questions. Sometimes people might not understand that abuse is happening to them, and it might fall outside of the answers of those 4 questions. And so just opening the door and opening the conversation to whatever they are looking for support with is going to be crucial. So what kind of help would be most useful for you, whether that's, you know, just providing resources, or whether that's going as far as making a referral. Those are kind of some of the things that we can open up the conversations with, and just making sure that we are always checking ourselves. We do not know their situation, they know it, and validating and helping them get what they are looking for is very important. Another big do not is, do not focus on what's wrong. Obviously, during disclosures, there are events of abuse or power and control that are hurtful for the patient that you're talking with, but really not focusing on those and focusing on the fact that they have disclosed and how we can support them is going to be a great step towards building that rapport and helping them in the long term. Another thing is conversations about IPV and domestic violence. As we said in the trigger warning, we don't know who that is going to affect. So do not talk with coworkers about what's wrong with families that are experiencing abuse, because anybody can be experiencing it. We are not in a victim blaming mindset when we are doing this screening. We are, you know, hoping to just get them out of what's happening and not just focusing on the fact that it is happening. Some of the things that we can do specifically when patients are in an OBGYN clinic, but in every clinic, is celebrating their strength. A lot of people don't even get to the point of disclosing that they are experiencing abuse. And so letting them know that that is a very important step towards getting themselves to the safety and security that they deserve is what you can do in this role. So some of the things that you can say we've put on here, you're doing a great job. You've been through so much. You are so strong. You're getting help. That takes incredible bravery. The people in your life, your babies, your kids are lucky to have you. Celebrating the fact that they are there, that they are disclosing, that they are taking their safety into their own hands is something that we can do. That's a very easy step to opening the conversation even further.
Okay. Casey has shared a lot of really great do's and don'ts so far. I'm going to share one more that can be particularly sensitive and I think makes a lot of people nervous. And this is around mandated reporting. So we suggest that you take the approach of not making reports to CPS or law enforcement without patient knowledge or consent where possible. We understand that there are mandated reporting responsibilities, so we'll make some suggestions about how you can take this suggestion and make it work in your clinic and still recognize your legal mandated reporting responsibilities. And we really think that the best way to do this is to first and foremost understand what your mandated reporting responsibilities are, what meets that line in the sand where you need to make a report, and then to be transparent with patients about your reporting responsibilities. This means oftentimes starting a conversation by sharing your mandated reporter status and a little bit about what that would mean if they were to make a disclosure. This is particularly important because the fear of mandated reporting or CPS or law enforcement involvement where it's not wanted is a large fear for domestic violence victims. It's a reason that many victims give to not want to come forward with what is happening to them. So what can that look like, right? So you want to start a conversation about being a mandated reporter so that a patient can make their own decision about what they want to disclose to you. This can help set up the boundaries and expectations for a conversation. And I think it's important to include why, excuse me, why would a mandated report be necessary and what would happen once the information is reported. This is sort of your preamble before having some of these conversations. What you include here about your mandated reporting responsibilities will differ depending on your employer, on your role, on your credentialing. So we really encourage here that you defer to your employer's policy and the other pieces of your credentialing and really understand what those are for your own self and your own role so that you can accurately communicate those to the patients that you work with. We also encourage that you communicate this early and often, right? It might not get through, the message might not get through the very first time. So coming back to this in subsequent conversations is always a good idea. When we talk about mandated reporting in a medical setting, I think there's a lot of worry that we hear from providers around, I'm going to offend somebody, I'm going to scare somebody off, right? They worry about that harm to report that can be done. But from our perspective, the transparency about the risks versus the potential harm to rapport, the benefits really outweigh the risks here, because while it might encourage somebody to take a step back from immediately disclosing, we really have found that it plants the seeds for ongoing trust and respect in the relationship if the patient feels like you're being straightforward with them and you're not, for instance, thinking about making a report behind their back or not sharing some important information with them at the outset. If you are a mandated reporter and you share this role with patients, maybe patients will decide, okay, this is not the place that I want to disclose what's happening in my family. And so you always want to offer another door, right? Offer to connect the patients to confidential services where they can have these conversations without it requiring a mandated report. This might look like a conversation with a domestic violence advocate or an attorney. And so many domestic violence hotlines, clients can reach out anonymously and get help without ever even disclosing their personal identification. So if you are a mandated reporter and share this with your patients, make sure that you're opening another door where they can feel safe to disclose if they choose not to disclose with you. Another do here is to provide and make sure that your clinic has resources to give to patients once they disclose, right? Casey talked a lot about having a positive, sort of non-judgmental, affirming response when somebody discloses. Beyond what you say to them and how you support them in that moment, offering resources that they can either read in the office or take home with them is a critical step to, again, open that door to ongoing help, if that makes sense for that person. On your screen, I'm sharing some screenshots of materials that we have available at our website, which is familypeacecenter.org, where you can download these resources free of charge to be used in your clinic setting. I think whenever we're thinking about resources, right, it's important to think about where they're taking these and if they're bringing them home. If they're still living with their abusive partner, this can be a really dangerous thing to show up to the house with, right? So we like to encourage folks to think of ways that they can hide the resources that they send home with patients. So some successful ways that we've done this in clinics that we've worked with in the past is maybe the clinic has a folder that they're handing new patients anyhow at an intake. That includes information about the clinic, information about some general services, and then this is just one piece tucked in there. So it sort of looks like, you know, this comes as a part of the standard intake packet. You could also offer the patient to go over the resources in the clinic and literally leave them there if they don't feel safe taking a physical piece of paperwork home. We've also had success with disclaimer stickers that we post on resources, right? This particular information pertains to a clinic that's treating pregnant patients, but you can amend the wording to work for your medical setting, right? So saying something like, the risk for abuse increases in pregnancy, or the risk for abuse in relationships is a common concern that we see in our clinic. We give this brochure to every clinic or every patient in our clinic. Talk to your provider for more information. That type of disclaimer can do a lot to allay concerns that might be raised if somebody causing harm sees one of these brochures and says, you know, why did you get this? You must have said something to trigger them to hand you this brochure. Well, the person then can point to that disclaimer sticker and say, no, I think to give it to everybody, right? Besides brochures, the person might be in a place where a referral for some ongoing support from another program or individual might make sense. Now, the type of referrals that you're going to be making for your patients depend on the resources that you have in your community. So that's an important part of integrating a screening process in your clinic, is knowing what those local resources are. Once you sort of have this menu of resources, we'll say, you can consider a few different things when thinking about what might be the appropriate referral for this patient. First of all, considering how the survivor identifies. Is there a religion that they are affiliated with? Is there a racial or ethnic group? Are they perhaps an LGBTQ identified patient that might want services that are specific to any one of those identities? You can also offer multiple options, right? One size does not fit all, and there are certain resources that are gonna make sense for some patients and not others, and giving them the option to choose is always the best practice. Emphasizing the fact that many nonprofit domestic violence or sexual assault providers provide the services free and confidentially, right? So we mentioned the importance of opening the door to a confidential conversation that doesn't necessarily result in a mandated report, and suggesting a conversation with a domestic violence advocate is a great way to do that. And it's also great to let patients know ahead of time that those services are free of charge. Hotlines are great. They can be a great first step for somebody sort of dipping their toe into, I'm going to reach out and see what help is available, because they can be used anonymously. Many hotlines, including Sojourner's own hotline, also receive texts now, so text line as well as a hotline can be a great option for a survivor to anonymously reach out for some conversations about what safety strategies. Just a reminder for yourself also that safety strategies may include staying in the relationship for the time being. Maybe there are some pieces that the survivor needs to put in place around custody and placement, around securing housing, around securing essential documents and documentation for themselves that they need to put in place before being able to safely move on from the relationship. And so recognizing that a safety strategy for the meantime might mean staying in the relationship and being open to that if the patient shares that with you. And then lastly, I think it's important to emphasize that one of the most dangerous dynamics of domestic violence or intimate partner violence is the isolation, right? It's an intentional tactic used by many people that cause harm in their relationships to intentionally isolate or keep the abuse secret. And that isolation and that secrecy really increases the danger. So encouraging the survivor to find somebody to talk to, if that's somebody in their personal life or their professional life, is really important. It might not be you. It might be their aunt who really gets it or understands, right? It might be their sister or their neighbor. It might be another domestic violence organization in the city. But encouraging connection with someone that they can trust and they feel safe disclosing to is an important piece of your conversation. One of the last pieces we want to leave you with is this idea of referrals and resources as planting a seed. So not every patient that you talk to and that has disclosed is going to want to immediately go into shelter or immediately sign up for a support group or immediately leave the relationship, right? And so we want to discourage the idea that a patient refusing a referral the first time you mention it or in that conversation is a failure. We also want to discourage, I feel like we've come to this point a few times in this training because it's so important. We also want to discourage you getting discouraged with patients that stay with their abusive partner for the short term or for the long term, and to not do that as a failure. At our organization and the domestic violence advocacy work that we do, we hear so many times when we ask clients, how did you hear about us? How did you get connected to us? They mention conversations that they've had years ago, and it took them that long to reach out for help. But that seed was planted by somebody who had a trusting conversation with them that they eventually acted on. So the patient doesn't walk out of your clinic setting and leave the relationship immediately. We don't want you to view that as a failure. And we want you to recognize that the conversations that you're having and the trust and rapport that you're building and the doors that you're opening for people really are that seed that's being planted that might take a while to germinate. But that's okay, and that's part of the process. In this last part of our module today, I will share some specific resources to our area of the country. So Sojourner Family Peace Center is located in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so what you see on your screen here are Milwaukee specific resources in the Milwaukee and surrounding areas. So you see that Sojourner is a domestic violence provider in the area, but we are certainly not the only one. There are a number of culturally specific organizations that you can see on your screen. There are also, like I mentioned previously, LGBTQ specific support and other programs that have different specialties. So again, considering how the survivor identifies and what might make the most sense for them is an important piece of understanding where you might make a suggestion for that person to reach out for help. Beyond the immediate Milwaukee area, there are statewide resources within Wisconsin, as well as national resources that you can provide to patients. And then lastly, we'll share a little bit about our own center, Sojourner Family Peace Center. While we're not the only domestic violence agency in town, we do want to share a little bit about what we have to offer if you choose to make a referral to Sojourner. So our physical facility is located at 6th and Walnut in Milwaukee. You can see the outside of the building there. Here you see some photos from our emergency shelter. I like to share these because I think a lot of times when you have a conversation or when patients are considering the idea of shelter, this isn't what comes to mind, right? I think a lot of times they think about, maybe a gym with a bunch of bunk beds or sleeping bags on the floor. I don't think oftentimes folks think of this hotel-like setting as what we're talking about when we're talking about shelter. But the residence rooms that you can see on top of your screen there, as well as the bedrooms and the common areas, are what our shelter at 6th and Walnut looks like. And they can be helpful to share with patients who are considering that, who might have a different idea of what shelter looks like in their mind. This is the reception desk and waiting area at Sojourner Family Peace Center, in addition to housing folks that are staying in our shelter. We have a public side of our building as well, because we serve many, many people who live out in the community and who come in for services and that are not living with us. And so this is what that public side of the building looks like, and some of our private safety waiting areas. We also have a very robust children's program. We can serve kids all the way from babies all the way up to teenagers, doing a few things, right? So if somebody's leaving a relationship and has children, and all of a sudden they're a single caregiver of children, having childcare while somebody's accessing things like support group or talking with a district attorney or accessing any of the other services can be a really important piece of allowing that access to service. Beyond childcare, our children's program does a number of curriculum and safety-based activities with children. We run parent and child support groups as well as teen support groups. We take a bunch of kids to camp in summer. And so we certainly serve survivors that don't have children, but many, around 80% of the survivors that we do serve do have children. And we do our best to meet their needs as well. As the final piece of our module today, I'm going to give you one more opportunity for some skills practice. So imagine you have done everything we suggested well, right? A patient discloses IPV. I would like you now to pause your module and practice a few different things about how you might respond after somebody tells you, yes, I am experiencing domestic violence. First, we would like you to practice a reaffirming and non-judgmental response to a positive disclosure. What can you say when somebody says yes in the moment to offer them that support? And then we also would like you to get familiar with the IPV or DV resources in your area. Maybe you're in the Milwaukee area and some of the resources that we shared in this training are relevant to you. If so, great. If not, you should get familiar with the local resources in your area. And once you have a good handle on what those resources might be, make sure that you're placing that information and resources in your clinic setting so that the other providers in your practice and clinic setting might have access to those resources as well. All right, that is the end of Module 2 of our training, Caring for Patients Who Experience Domestic Violence. I want to thank you for spending so much time learning about how to care for these patients and creating an environment where we open the doors to healing. Thank you, everybody.